Hey, we are wrapping up the series today of I Love Jesus, but and then fill in the blank. And so today I am talking about I love Jesus, but I doubt. But I have doubts, but I doubt a little. I have these things in my life. And like Jeff said, he encouraged you to take those note cards and a marker or a pen and write down your doubts. And if you haven't done so, I want to encourage you why I'm up here anytime today. These things that you kind of have in your life, these things that kind of pop up and you're like, I'm really struggling with this, or I really don't know about this. Take some time, because there is something important, there is something powerful about identifying some of these things that we have in our life, some of these things that we struggle with, and being able to say, this is that thing, and being able to identify it and be able to know where to start working on it. But how many of you, just in general, how many of you are like doubtful, a little cynical kind of people? Do you guys have this? Like, this is me. Like when people come up and say things, this is the one that always gets me. If someone comes up and was like, man, you should go see this movie. This was the best movie I've ever seen. My first instinct is I doubt it. It's probably not that good. Or they'll come and say, oh man, I just went to this restaurant and it's so good. And again, the first thing I think is it's probably not that good. Like, it's not as good as the restaurants, like my favorite restaurants. But I have this doubtfulness still in my life from however many years ago. Do you remember when like LeBron James was in high school and everybody kept saying, this is the next Michael Jordan, this is the next Michael Jordan, he's going to be better? Like, I got so tired of hearing that I still cheer against LeBron. Like, I do not like LeBron because of that cynicism and that doubt of just saying this guy's going to be good. And I have to tell you, if I'm completely honest, Browns fans, if you guys don't shut up about this upcoming year, about how good you're going to be, I'm cheering against the Browns big time. I'm giving you guys 7 wins because I'm sick and tired of hearing about how good you guys are going to be this year because of Odell Beckham. He's had one good catch. Ryan in the back. Okay, I'm tired of hearing about it. The first thing I think with all this talk of how this season, my first thought is I doubt it. I doubt it's going to be as good as everybody says it is. But let me ask you this. How many of you have ever had doubts when it comes to your faith? Raise your hand up. Raise it up high and hold it up. Okay, now turn it around. Look around. Keep your hands up. Look around. Look at all the bad Christians. Put your hand. No, listen. I want you to be able to see this. This is something that we all deal with. This is something that we all struggle with. Now, raise your hand. Tell me, have you ever felt guilty about these doubts, for having these doubts? Yeah. Okay, and that's the problem when it comes to doubt, and that was kind of the struggle I had when writing the sermon was, I guess I want you to walk away with thinking a couple things. First of all, I want you to realize that we all have doubts. You know, everyone in here at one time or another has struggled with stuff. Maybe you struggle with stuff. Maybe there's something right now in your life that you're just like, I'm just really dealing with this. And secondly, I want you to know that it's okay to have those doubts. But also, when you leave here, I want you to know that I don't want you to stay with these doubts. I don't want these doubts to stay in your life. I want this to be something that, yes, you have it, and yes, it's okay because everybody else does, but we need to look at these doubts and identify these doubts and work on these doubts. And I think what makes maybe this topic a little different than everything else we've talked about is everything else is the stuff in our life that we need to get rid of, and like selfishness is bad and complaining is bad, and Jeff had that huge list of all the things on the screen last week. Those things are bad. In doubt, it's okay, but we don't want you to stay in those doubts. You see, we need to realize that, first of all, doubt is not the absence of faith. That doesn't make you any less of a Christian. And secondly, you need to know that God doesn't love you any less because of those things that you've written down on your note card. That does not change the way God views you. And if you open up the Bible and you read the different stories in the Bible, you'll see that there are countless stories of good people that followed God but still struggled with doubt. Even the people that were closest to Jesus, the people who walked with Jesus, and the people who actually learned at Jesus' feet struggled with doubt. So for those of us that are on this side of Jesus, it's okay. Because the people that knew Jesus intimately still had their doubts, still had their times of struggles. And probably the most famous, that when you're preaching on doubt, you have to talk about Thomas. He was the most famous doubter. He's the one that all ministers go to when we're talking about this topic. And Thomas is really only mentioned a couple times in the Bible. The first time he's mentioned is right at the end of Jesus' life, at the end of Jesus' ministry. Jesus tells his disciples, he says, we need to go to Bethany. I got some stuff to take care of. And the problem with Bethany was it was a town that was right outside of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was this kind of hotbed of controversy. It was where all the people that wanted Jesus dead, that's where all these people were. And he said, we need to go right outside of Jerusalem. I've got some stuff to do. And all the disciples are saying, this is a bad idea. You know, you're just asking for trouble if we show up there. And then Thomas, one of the first times we learn about him, he speaks up. And he says, let us go so we may die with him. So this is the first thing that Thomas says. And I read this one of two ways. First of all, you could read this that Thomas was courageous. Like Thomas, Jesus said, we need to go to Bethany. Everybody says, no, this is a bad idea. Everybody wants you dead. They're probably going to kill you. You could read this and say, Thomas says, come on, guys, let us go. And then we're just going to go ahead. We'll die with them. But I don't read it that way because I'm cynical and I doubt and I read it. And I feel for Thomas because I think Thomas said it this way. He said, fine. He throws his hands up in the air. And he says, let us go with them. And then we can just go ahead and die with them. And then leaves the room. That's how I picture Thomas. That's how I picture, because if I was Thomas, that's the thing I would say. I'm sarcastic. I'm cynical. It's not a good thing. It's something I struggle with, and I try to not do, but it comes out. And this is how I view Thomas, because the second thing where we find Thomas is where he got his nickname. Everybody knows Doubting Thomas. It's kind of unfair. It was just a moment of weakness, and now forever, this guy is known as Doubting Thomas. Because what happens is Jesus goes to Bethany, his disciples go with him, he does this thing, and then Jesus goes into Jerusalem. This is where everybody that hates Jesus, that wants him dead, is there. And Jesus rides in to Jerusalem on a donkey. There's palm leaves, and this is what we actually celebrate today. Today's considered Palm Sunday. And while he's in Jerusalem, he's arrested, he's crucified, and then we find the disciples, and they're scared, and they're lost, and they really don't know what to do because Jesus was their Messiah, and in their thinking, Messiahs don't die. And so they're confused, and they don't know what to do, and they're scared that everybody's going to be coming for them next. And even though Jesus predicted this and said, guys, I'm going to die. And throughout the entire Old Testament, there's all kinds of verses that say the Messiah is going to die. These men just couldn't wrap their minds around the fact that Jesus is dead. So in John 20 and verse 24, it says, now Thomas, also known as Didymus means twin. Actually, people think that Thomas looked a lot like Jesus, so he had another nickname called Didymus. So Thomas, one of the 12, he was not with the disciples when Jesus came, so the other disciples told him, hey, we have seen the Lord. We have seen Jesus. But he said to them, no, unless I see the nail marks in his hand, if I put my finger where the nails were, if I put my hand in his side, it's disgusting, I will not believe. And I have to be honest, when I read about Thomas, I identify with Thomas because if my friends came and told me this crazy, wild story, I know that my first instinct would be like, I don't think so. Not unless I see it with my own eyes, am I going to believe what you guys are saying. This says, a week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came in and stood among them and said, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, Thomas, put your finger here, see my hands. Reach your hand out and put it in my side. Just stop doubting and believe. See, Jesus wasn't there when Thomas said all this stuff, that Thomas said, this is what I need to be able to believe. But Jesus shows up and says, Thomas, come here. Here you go. If this is what it takes for you to believe. And then Thomas responds and he says, my Lord and my God. And this was a huge response in that day because what he's saying is, he's saying, you really are the Messiah. And it was against the law to call another human being God. This was actually a capital offense. Thomas could be crucified, actually be crucified upside down just for saying these words. But he says, I see you. You know, it's okay. I don't need to do it. I don't need to touch it. I believe you, my Lord and my God. And then Jesus told him, because you have seen me, you've believed. But blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. And that's talking about us. He's saying, Thomas, you've seen me, and it's good. You didn't have to come up and touch my hands. Like, you saw me, that was enough. You believed that I was the Son of God, that I really am the Messiah. But think about all these people. Think about us in the future, that we don't get the luxury of seeing Jesus face to face. And how blessed are they that will believe without actually seeing him? And I know that when we stand up here and we tell stories, I'm sure you've sat there at some point and said, man, if I was a part of that story, my faith would be so much stronger. If I was Moses and God spoke to me in a burning bush, like, heck yes, I would believe. Like, I would have no doubts. Or if I was Peter and I could just take a couple steps and walk on water, like, my faith would be so much stronger. But objective proof doesn't always lead to a genuine kind of faith. Because look at Moses. All through Moses' life, Moses struggled with God, and he had his doubts about God. And Peter, even though Peter walked on water, Peter still struggled with doubt. Peter still struggled in his faith. See, we have these doubts no matter what our background is, no matter how long you've been a Jesus follower, no matter how long you've been coming to church. We all have these moments of doubt and these struggles and these things that maybe get in our way of our relationship with God. So I've broken them down into 3 categories. I referred to them as hurdles. They're hurdles because they slow us down. They're hurdles because it's something that we have to get over. They're hurdles because they trip us up, right, Sierra? Hurdles trip us up. That's a mean joke. Sierra might have tripped over a hurdle a couple weeks ago. I could not do it. I'm sorry. These hurdles are things that get in our relationship with Jesus. Sorry, Sierra. You knew it was going to happen. The first one I call intellectual hurdles. And you probably know what this is. These are doubts that are raised most likely by people outside of the church. Things that studies and different things, and you hear this stuff, and you got Bill Nye, the science guy that you grew up learning from, and now all of a sudden he's saying things, and you're like, oh man, he's so smart, but I don't know if that goes along with what I believe. And then it raises these kind of maybe thoughts and struggles in our head. I remember when I was the youth minister in Pittsburgh, this movie came out. Do you remember the Da Vinci Code? Okay, and do you remember the controversy that was around the Da Vinci Code? And Christians were like freaking out over this movie and was like, we should boycott this movie and all this stuff that this fictional movie is talking about. We shouldn't go see it. And so I had this idea that I was going to take some of the older kids from the youth group, and we were going to actually go see the movie, and then we'd go out for coffee afterwards and talk about it. And I thought it was a good idea. And I thought, we're going to go and we'll face these doubts that are being raised by this movie. And I had a lady from our church just flip out and was like, you cannot take our teenagers to go see this movie. Like, you cannot expose them to that kind of information. And I didn't do it. Now I would have done it, but I was a lot younger back then, and I said, okay, I probably shouldn't take them. But this kind of proves that we have this fear of facing some of these doubts. And I've had these times where I've struggled intellectually, that there's things that I see or I read and I say, oh my gosh, like I know that this was what the Bible says, but this is what like science is saying, and I go back and forth. But what I've learned is it's best to not build my faith on stuff like this. It's best to build your faith on Jesus and grace and forgiveness and these intellectual science stuff that everybody argues on. It's best to not build your faith in those kind of things. The first one is intellectual. The second thing is spiritual. These are the questions that we find ourselves asking. Questions like, is there really a heaven? Did the stories in the Bible, did they really happen? Like, is Jesus really the Son of God? Maybe the doubts that you face, the struggles that you face are, am I truly saved? Am I really forgiven? That stuff, that my old way of life, did God really forgive me of that? Why am I still struggling with guilt? Or God, why am I still struggling with this one sin? See, what makes these spiritual hurdles different than intellectual hurdles is the intellectual hurdles, you research and you talk to other people, but what makes this different is this is more personal. Like, we want you to talk about these things that you struggle with and these questions, but this requires you to do some work. This requires you to spend some time reading the Bible. This requires you to spend some time praying. I had read this quote, it was about 6 months ago, and I read it and I kept going and I came back to it, and I have it written down different places on my phone, it's just one of those quotes that hasn't gone away. And it says, nothing changes if nothing changes. And I've gone back to this a lot. And I think about these things when it comes to spiritual hurdles that you struggle with. These struggles that you have, and you're like, man, I just really want to get over this. If nothing changes in your life, if you don't start reading the Bible more and start praying more, then nothing is going to change. And when it comes to these spiritual hurdles, and if this is something you've written down, you need to realize that nothing is going to change in your life if you don't change something in your life. And that's what makes the spiritual hurdles different, because it's more personal. It requires more work from you. And the third one is probably one that probably a lot of you face, and that's circumstantial hurdles. I dare say that probably a lot of your doubts have come from something that's happened to you in this life. This is all the whys that we face in the life. Like, you went through something and you feel like God didn't show up. Or you say, man, why did that person have to die? Or why did this relationship fall apart? Or God, where were you? Why did I have to go through this? If I'm being totally honest, this is probably where most of my doubts come from. The most of my struggles come from of just saying, God, why is this happening to me? I feel like I've dedicated my life to you. Why am I facing this? Why am I going through this? Why did this have to happen? And this is where a lot of my frustrations come in. I'd say probably my most recent struggle was this whole idea of foster care. Not having the kids, that's a whole different struggle. Like, we actually have the kids now, and that's crazy, different kinds of struggle. But my struggle came because 2.5 years ago, I stood up here. And I stood up here and I talked about how we felt like God was calling us to do this 2.5 years ago. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this was in January, like, we're going to go through this process. In June, we're going to have kids. Like, we'll get all through it. 2.5 years ago, it took forever. And we would get a couple steps ahead, and then something would happen, and we'd fall back, and we went all the way through, and we got licensed, and then it took even more time, and we'd get phone calls and say, hey, can you take these kids? And we're like, yeah, we'll definitely take them, and then we'd hear nothing. And I remember just saying, God, like, what's going on? Why is it taking so long? Like, what? And this was one of my prayers. God, you made me look stupid in front of my church. Like, God, I stood up there and said, this is what we're going to do, and now it's not happening. And now I look like a liar in front of Crossroads. And that was I've said that prayer quite a few times. And these hurdles are probably the hardest to get over. These hurdles are difficult because it's the pain of living in a fallen world. It's the things that take our eyes off of Jesus. But here's the thing with circumstantial doubts. If you let these circumstantial doubts go, they eventually turn into spiritual doubts. You face some kind of loss or tragedy, and you say, God, why did you allow this to happen? And then the next thing you know, a few months later, you're still struggling with it, and you said, if this happened, if I lost this person, then is God really good? If God took this person away from me, is God really good? And then you find yourself struggling with spiritual doubts. And then if you don't do something, it turns into intellectual doubts, because you find yourself saying, I have no evidence of God in my life, so therefore there is no God. And it's through this process that we see people leave the church. It's through this process that people walk away from their faith and say, I can't do this. Like, there's no God. And it goes through these three hurdles. There's a story in Matthew 28 where this is another instance where Jesus had died and he was resurrected, and he shows up and he's up on a mountain. And some of the disciples were there, and some of his followers that followed him through his life were there. And Matthew has this interesting verse, and it's Matthew 28:17, and it says, "When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted." And I've read this before, but I've gone back and I've questioned, why did Matthew put this in? You have to think that if Matthew's idea of writing the gospel was to show everybody that Jesus truly was the Son of God, then why would Matthew throw in these words and even tell us some people there didn't believe? Some people doubted. But when I read it and I read Jesus talking and the things that he said, Jesus doesn't even acknowledge these people. It's like Jesus just keeps going, and he knows he's got to know that there's people there, because there's people worshiping, but then there's some people over here standing off, and they have those doubts written down on their note cards, and they're like, I just don't know. And it's like Jesus saying, it's okay, you'll get there. Like, guys, I'm just glad that you're here. I'm just glad that you're here with me. So I guess the question is, what do we do with these doubts? You have these doubts written down on your note cards. What do we do with these doubts? How can you overcome them? And all I can do is I can tell you what I do. Not saying that this is the right way, but this is how I have to get through this kind of stuff. The first thing that I do is I have to turn to the resurrection. Just like Thomas. Thomas needed to know that Jesus truly rose from the dead. And if he could just truly understand or realize that Jesus really did raise from the dead, then Thomas was good. Thomas was ready to go. And I find myself getting to a point where I say, if I can just believe that Jesus rose from the grave, if Jesus rose from the dead and truly was resurrected, then I can face anything. There's a verse that I love in 1 Corinthians 15. It says, if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Jesus has been raised. And I like this verse. It says, and if Jesus has not been raised, then our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. If there's no resurrection, then this up here is a waste of time. And if there is no resurrection, then your faith, it's pointless. But if Jesus truly did raise from the dead, if Jesus really did conquer death, then that changes everything. So there's three things, and then this is the way my mind works, that if I can work through these three things, and if I can believe this, then I'm good to go. Okay, intellectually, if I can believe that Jesus raised from the dead, if I can build my faith on that, then I'm good. And so there's three things that I turn to. I guess this would be, like in college, they called this like apologetics, similar to that. The first thing that I go to is, I go through three things. I go through the empty tomb, I go through the disciples, and I go through the church. And these are all things that I can prove, that I can see tangible evidence. First of all, the empty tomb. If you look back in history, the early Jewish authorities, the people that hated Jesus, the people that wanted Jesus dead, the people that were responsible for him being crucified, even those people admit that the tomb was empty. They said that they don't know what happened, but there was no body in the tomb. And so this is coming from a hostile source. And what you can do is you can look back in history and you can see that Jesus' tomb was never turned into a shrine. Because what happened in that culture with the Jewish culture, and even in like pagan culture, when somebody important, when somebody religious, when somebody respected, like spiritual gurus, when they died, they would go to the tomb and they would have candles and flowers around the body. And this was a place where people could come and actually pay their respects. And people would actually come from all over. And this was kind of a, we'll say, tourist attraction that you would go and you would see this tomb. And there was no shrine ever made for Jesus' tomb. Why? Because his body wasn't there. it was an empty tomb. There was no shrine, there was no bones, and even the people that killed Jesus, they would have loved to have a shrine to Jesus, because this was a way that they could say, listen, this was your Messiah, this was your leader, and look, here's his dead body, here's his pile of bones. Go ahead and come worship it, because he obviously didn't raise from the dead. But that didn't happen. And so the second thing that I work through in my head is the disciples. And you might sit there and say, well, okay, so maybe somebody just stole the body. Maybe the disciples probably just went in and they had it all planned out, like, let's go in and let's steal Jesus' body. First of all, when you read the story, Rome put a 2,000-pound boulder in front of this tomb. This wasn't a small little rock. This was this huge thing, and they put this seal over, and it was said that if anyone breaks this seal, they would be put to death. And then in front of the boulder, they put a few of their most well-trained soldiers. This would be like Navy SEAL type guys standing in front of the tomb. And these guys knew that if they screwed up and something happened to the body, that they were going to be executed. And so, a couple questions. When you go back and you read about the disciples after Jesus died, you find the disciples, they were scared and they were hiding and they were locking themselves in the room, and they knew that, okay, they came after Jesus, now they're going to come after us, and we are scared out of our minds and we don't know what to do. And Peter, when Jesus was being arrested and crucified, like a little girl said, weren't you one of the disciples? And he's like, I curse you, little girl, I swear to you. And he's yelling at little girls, and they're hiding in rooms. Do you believe that these men all of a sudden had enough courage to face these well-trained soldiers, all of a sudden face and risk their own death, somehow be able to move this 2,000-pound rock, all for a hoax, all for a made-up story? And secondly, when you look at the disciples' lives, there was 11 left. Remember, Judas was gone, and 10 out of the 11 disciples were killed for their beliefs. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know if I would die for a made-up story. Like if all leadership here got together and said, guys, this is what we're going to do. We're going to grow Crossroads. Let's pretend Corey died this weekend and he raised from the dead. And man, people are going to want to come to our church now because okay, if we go through the story and we're like, okay, we're not going to tell anybody. If someone has a gun to my head, sorry, Corey. I'm not sticking up for you, man. Not for a made-up story. But when you look at what the disciples did, they faced awful, terrible, torturous deaths. All because they believed that Jesus rose from the dead. And the 11th, that was John. They knew that if they killed John, that it was only going to cause more uproar, and so they took John and said, you're doing so much stuff here, we're just going to throw you on an island so you can't talk to anybody. And John lived the rest of his life secluded on this island. And all these men, when they faced death, when they were crucified and stabbed and stoned and beheaded, not one single one of them ever changed their story, because something incredible must have happened. So for me, first I go to the tomb, second I go to the disciples, and lastly I go to the church. This is what we would call like the first church. This is when there was Judaism, and then Jesus came, and Jesus brought a new way of teaching and a new way of living, and this is what we call the first church. This is where we see the beginning of Christianity. And when Jesus was alive, he had thousands of followers. Where he went, people would come from all over to listen to him teach. And people were following him around. But by the time he came to the end of his life, he maybe only had, they estimate, about 120 followers left. A lot of this is because he would preach these crazy things like, if you follow me, you're going to face suffering. If you follow me, you need to love your enemies. If you follow me, you need to make yourself less. And people started hearing these things and say, maybe this isn't for me. But after Jesus died on the cross and he was resurrected, something amazing happened. The Bible says that Jesus appeared to a little over 500 people. 500 different people witnessed Jesus after he died on that cross. But then when you look at the first church, that there was 120 followers and there's these disciples, and then all of a sudden the church started to explode. And when you go and you read in Acts, it says that numbers were just being added constantly. Every day, new people were coming to this church. They were leaving their old way of life. They were leaving Judaism. There were people that pagan, Gentile people, Roman people that were leaving and following Christianity, following the teachings of Jesus. All because something significant had to have happened, some sort of catalyst that pushed the church into something amazing. See, I start, for me, with the resurrection. If I can believe in the resurrection, if I can believe this, then I can face a lot of my other doubts. And that's the first thing I do. And the second thing I do is I have to look to my past. In Exodus, there's a story between God and Moses. And in Moses' day, when you worshiped a god, you made a wooden kind of stone carving, something that you could visually see, something that you could touch. And this is what you worshiped. This is what you bowed down to. This was the way that you honored your God. And Moses is struggling because he says, God, I can't see you. I can't touch you. I'm having trouble understanding you, like what you want from me. He's having a hard time wrapping his mind around God. He says, if you want me to lead these people, I need to be able to see something. I need something visual, something tangible that I can do, that I can go back to these people and say. And so God says, okay, go stand by this rock, and I'm going to pass by. In Exodus 33, verse 23, he says, then I'll take my hand away from you, and you will see my back, but you will not see my face. God explains to them, anyone that sees his face will not be able to live. There's a lot of discussion about this verse. There's a lot of discussion about what does that mean by seeing my back. One of the translations I had to change said backside. I couldn't put it up there because my immaturity. Like if I was preaching on this with the teens, I would say when God mooned Moses. And so many translations say backside, and I couldn't do it. And I read that wasn't in my notes, I shouldn't have said that. In the Hebrew, when it talks about back, when it says backside, when you translate that to what does that mean in Hebrew, it says where God was just at, where God had just been. So when he removed his hand from Moses' face and Moses looks out, he was able to not see God. He wasn't able to see his back, but he was able to see where God was just at, where God had been. We have trouble with these doubts. We have trouble with these things that we've faced in our life, and especially when it comes to the circumstantial doubts. You have trouble when you sit there and you write these down and you say, I just don't understand why this happened. But I hope that if you face some dark times, that if you've gone through some tragedy or some loss, that I hope that you can get to a point that you can look back and say, oh my gosh, I can see where God was at. I can see where God had been. I have this written really little because I don't want to talk about it. I talked about our struggle with foster care. There was a night a couple weeks ago. It was probably about a month ago that I sat and there was paperwork so much paperwork, so much stuff that we have to do, and I was going through it. And I was looking at the dates, birth dates, and things that, just were kind of in the paperwork. And I the dates started to kind of add up. Because we had in our head, we were going to go through this class, probably be done in about 6 months, be licensed. We would come out of that in the summer with a school-aged girl, one girl, not two, and we had this all kind of planned out. And I'm looking at the dates of some of this stuff, and it was just like a punch in the gut. Because I realized that at the same time that we were sitting in Columbus, on the other side of the city, that we were sitting through these awful classes. You have to do 40 hours of classes. We did them all within 2 weekends, and it was terrible to just sit and listen to all this stuff. And as we were sitting over near Polaris in Columbus listening to these classes, that at the same time, I kid you not, within days, our youngest was on the other side of the city in a hospital being born. And it hit me. The struggles and the frustration of all of it. And then the following weekend, we had to go back, and we had to do this all over again. And we had to do Friday night, Saturday, and then Sunday classes all over again. And in looking at the timeline, the first set of classes, Harmony was born. That set off some red flags for us, or for the system, for some of the authorities. The second weekend when we were back would have been the weekend that it was decided that the kids were not in a safe environment. So we're sitting in these classes, this plan in our head of what was going to happen, what our one single school-age child was going to be in our life. And meanwhile, God says, there's something going on. You guys just need to be patient. And I was frustrated, I was discouraged, and I went through this process just saying, God, come on. Like, why is this happening? And we get these two little girls, and it's tough. It's not like every day is like, oh, it's so amazing. Like, there's a lot of difficulties that come with foster care. But when I can look back and say, I can see where God was. And all that discouragement and all that frustration and all that calling out to God and that giant hurdle that we had to get over, God was working through that. And when I face things in my life and the circumstantial stuff where I find myself saying, God, why is this happening? Why are you making me go through this? When I can step back and I can look at some of the things I've faced in the past and I can see God was there the last time. God was working through this. So why would God not be working through what I'm struggling with now? I go to the resurrection and I go to my past. We don't always see God in the process, but you can look back and you can see where God had been. We're coming to a time of communion, and we're going to change it up. We have stations set up, and when the music plays, I want to encourage you just to look around to find one of the stations that's closest to you. And when you're ready, just get up and go and take communion. And if for some reason, if you're unable to get up, just raise your hand. We'll be glad to have somebody come and bring something to you. But communion is a time that we celebrate this resurrection. This is a time that we celebrate this reason we don't have to doubt anymore. And it's because of that resurrection that we're saved, that we have the promise of heaven. But also when you come up to take communion, I want you to bring your doubts. I want you to bring your note cards, the things that you wrote down, whatever that is. And after you take communion, before you sit down, if you could, take these doubts and just lay them at the foot of the cross. See, we have these doubts, and I feel like Jesus is saying, guys, I know you're struggling, but I'm just glad that you're here. Like, you'll get there. I'm just glad that you're here. But because of this resurrection, because of the fact that Jesus conquered death, we no longer have to face these doubts. We no longer have to struggle with these doubts because the God that is bigger than death is bigger than anything you have written on those cards. And so bring them up and say, God, this is me identifying what this is, and this is me laying it at the cross, and this is me saying, I am going to get over these doubts. I'm going to do whatever it takes to not let this get in the way of my relationship with you. Let me pray. God, we thank you for loving us. God, we thank you for loving us through our doubts, through our struggles, through the things that make it difficult for us to have a relationship with you. God, help us to identify these things and say, for us to be able to say, we don't want to deal with this anymore. God, we lay these doubts at your feet. God, help us to be able to get past these and help us to strive for a better relationship with you. It's in Jesus' name. Amen. And I feel like so much of our life, this is how I am responding to Jesus. Jesus, I love you. I believe. Help me with my unbelief. And I feel like that should be our prayer today. These doubts that you've brought forward, when these doubts show their head this week or you're just struggling, make that your prayer and just say, God, I believe. Can you just help me with my unbelief? Just help me with these things. These doubts that we brought to the cross, they're not meant to be permanent. These doubts should be temporary. These doubts should not stay at the cross. These doubts should not stay there. These doubts need to be worked on. These doubts need to be gone. These doubts are not going to stay here because Jesus didn't stay here. And it's because of the resurrection. It's because that Jesus is greater than death and bigger than any of the stuff that we could bring to him. And it's because of that why we can celebrate. And that's what we're going to do as we close. So we're going to celebrate. So if you could just stand and join us as we sing.